Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Kesha Rogers. I would like to thank you for joining us for today's proceedings and for this panel. I want to welcome everyone to this policy forum and discussion, which is being hosted by the Schiller Institute. And the title of today's discussion is "There Are No Limits to Growth. Mankind Must Conquer Space." Now, before I go into my further introduction of the proceedings for today and what we will be discussing here, I have a special musical offering first that I'd like to have come up, and then I will proceed from there. So we will be singing the national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose bright stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? On the shores dimly seen through the mist of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines on the stream. 'Tis the star-spangled banner, oh, long may it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Oh, thus be it ever, when free men shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace. May the heaven-rescued land praise the God that has made and preserved us a nation, then conquer and the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave. O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
There might be a reason for that. I'm related to music lure.
Okay, so once again, I would like to thank you all for joining us. I would like to thank our international audience for watching. And today, as I said, the discussion title is "There are no limits to growth. Mankind must conquer space." Today, I will be joined on the panel in this discussion by Tom Wysmuller, a member of the Right Climate Stuff, and a member of the NASA Alumni League. And I'd like to just give a special thanks to Tom for joining us. He came from a very long way. He drove here, and this guy's phenomenal. And all of the work that he and his group are doing to educate the population around what's going on. I'm also joined on the panel today by Beets, a leader of the LaRouche Policy Institute, LaRouche Science and Research Team. And just as I said, this event is being live streamed. And so we have an audience gathered here and also watching online. And for our audience here and online, I'd just like to say that we are going to have questions and answers after the three proceedings here, after the three presentations. Now, before I get to the other speakers, I do want to make just a few brief opening remarks myself on the nature of why we are here and also understanding what we seek for you to take from this discussion. First of all, let me just say that I've been a national leader in the fight to revive the true intentions of our space program since the egregious cuts and attacks by our current administration on our manned space program and the canceling of the Constellation program back in 2010. But to understand what is truly at stake, one need not look at simply what the budget cuts were or why some programs were chosen over others. But the real attack can be defined by what space pioneer and German spaceflight pioneer Krafft Ehricke would term the attack on man's extraterrestrial imperative. Now, Krafft Ehricke was quite a brilliant man and a genius, and he can be looked up to as an inspiration in understanding why we fight and must fight for a space program that identifies the true human intention of mankind and what must become of the future of mankind in conquering space. You know, Ehricke understood, first of all, that placing limitations on the imaginative and creative progress of mankind was the biggest attack against achieving the goals of conquering space. And he actually put forth a schematic that he addressed from the standpoint that if people did not fulfill man's true extraterrestrial imperative and allowed for limitations to be put on the progress of mankind, then you would see a society that would be attacked by war, starvation, famine, and would have a negative growth. Now, the thing is that is the policy which we're fighting against right now with the limits to growth that have been placed on mankind. This idea that there are limited resources, that there's too many people in the world. And that's what you're really fighting against right now. This idea of the Malthusian limited resources population reduction policy of the environmentalist fraud of man-made global warming. And one of the key attacks of this whole mindset of thinking is on the creative progress of mankind. But I must say that in order to combat this fraud, one cannot simply just retreat or refute, should I say, made up hockey stick models and ice core samples. But what is required is to get at the root of the matter. What is the realization of man's true self? That is what the fight is right now. There's many people out there who can debate and who can actually present some very scientific models as to why the people who are pushing the man-made global warming fraud is a hoax. But the question and what we seek to bring about in this entire discussion is, what is the attack on the creative nature of mankind? Why is the extraterrestrial imperative of mankind being attacked? Now, I would just like to say that to understand that one of the ideas that was put forth in a conference held about 31 years ago by the Schiller Institute, the organization that's sponsoring this event, founded by Helga Zelf LaRouche, and this was on the memorial conference honoring the life of Krafft Ehricke. And the title of the conference was "The Age of Reason in a World of Mutually Assured Survival and Space Colonization." And I think that conference characterized where we are today. The point that we face today is that we have lost the ability in our society to reason. When we take away our space program, the manned space program, and particularly the implications of what it truly represents, then what happens to the creative imagination of your society? What happens to the ability of your society, of mankind, to truly be able to reason as human beings who are seeking to further develop the intentions of our creator, the intentions of the creative process of the universe, and to discover more where mankind must go, the future that mankind must create? And during that panel discussion, Mrs. LaRouche characterized the thinking of Krafft Ehricke as one who understood that lifting the eyes of the world to the stars, industrialization and colonization of the moon and Mars were the intentions of mankind in mankind's extraterrestrial imperative. Now, what I'd like to do is just read a short quote here from Krafft Ehricke, which characterizes this fight against the limitations put on mankind. And Ehricke says, quote, "The world of modern industrial man is no more closed within the biosphere than it is flat. Preservation cannot be limited to the environment at the expense of human growth. Human growth must aim at nothing less than the achievement of a human living standard for all. The preservation of both environment and civilization hinges on technology and its translation into industry." many technologies are needed to overcome the present apparent limits to growth. But the one underlying unambiguous technology that makes many other industrial technologies possible, either directly or by spin-offs, is space technology. Very important. Now, the age of reason, the idea of what is the true nature of man, how do we come to understand and realize man's own true self, is through the development of space. And this is what Krafft Ehricke clearly understood and why we fight today. Now, as Krafft Ehricke said, there is no one and nothing under the natural laws of the universe that can place limitations on man except man himself. Now, that's important, because the problem is what's happened to our ability to reason. We have allowed limitations to be placed on us. So that's what we have to get at right now. That's what we have to get at in this discussion. And that we are now, with this national campaign and this international campaign that I've launched, that we will revive our space program, launching what I would call the awakening of a sleeping giant. And it's very interesting. I'll just make one report here that there was just a hearing in the Congress a few days ago with the former director of NASA, Mike Griffin, and head of also former astronaut Gene Cernan, and others who were there. And you can tell that there is an understanding, a hunger for this creative identity, for mankind to once again take its rightful place in the extraterrestrial imperative of man, of conquering space, of recognizing that that is the only thing is truly going to bring nations together. And we will have some further discussion about what other nations are doing to carry out this true imperative of mankind. And that when you have these speakers addressing, I'll just say this, addressing the Congress and saying that President John F. Kennedy, if he saw our space program today, would be rolling over in his grave. We have to think about that. They are absolutely correct. And, you know, the problem is that we also have an administration that's spitting on the grave of President Kennedy when they push forth such a policy. And we have to come together as a national and international community to recognize again that we have a mission for mankind, as other nations are starting to recognize, and the United States has to be brought forth in that mission for mankind. Now, I want to end with a statement from economist and statesman LaRouche, who was also at the proceedings of this conference, because I think it characterizes very well the nature of how we once again gain the age of reason. And he said that Krafft Ehricke understood the mission of mankind in colonizing and exploring space lies in removing all limitations. In a presentation he gave to the conference, he characterized the age of reason as the intent of the Creator that mankind's destiny is to become mankind in the universe. There, he says, quote, "There in the stars lies mankind's entry into the long-awaited age of reason, when our species sheds at last the cultural residue of the beast." And That's what we have to shed, because people have become bestial. You have a culture that's been destroyed. You look at the conditions of life on the planet right now. We have to awaken in the spirit of the population a new paradigm, a new direction for mankind. And you see that we're on the verge of doing that. If you look at what's going on in some other countries and the fight that's even taking place here in the United States. So now with those thoughts in mind, I would like you to hear our other speakers from that standpoint, from the understanding of how do we define the future for mankind. And I thank you all for being here today. So what I'd like to do is now pass the presentation on to Tom Wysmuller, who will be speaking today. And then we will have Megan Beets following him. And after that, we will be happy to take questions. Thank you.
All right, hello. I'm not quite sure where I want to start, but that was a neat introduction because I'm going to try to piggyback on it, okay? I was born at the right time. If I had been born in the 1800s, I might have read Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon and say, gee, look at that, we can fire a cannon and get to the moon. Of course, you kill anybody who's in that capsule. There was no way possible for anybody in the 1800s to get to the moon. Couldn't do it. We didn't have the technology. We had the will. There were people who wanted to do it, who really wanted to get to the moon. And Jules Verne was one of them. But he couldn't do it. He could only dream about it. He could write about it. What was made possible for me was that when I was in school, I could read Jules Verne, but there was a real possibility of mankind actually getting to the moon and maybe going beyond. This is pretty neat. So I focused on that in my career. I ended up studying meteorology, but I ended up getting my dream job. And my dream job was at NASA. I was an intern, but actually what they call an executive intern. He was supposed to be learning to become the replacements for people in the agency who were moving up. And they encouraged us to develop a whole series of technical skills and abilities and assignments. So I learned an awful lot at NASA. Again, it was my dream job. I'm still dreaming, by the way. I haven't stopped. And what I'd like to do is share with you some slides that I presented up in Boston about a month ago. And if you want to do the first slide, I can't even see them ahead of time, so I'm not quite sure what's going to be showing up here. Do you want me to remove the slip of paper?
No, I got it.
Okay. Got it?
Yeah, I'm just getting it shared ready.
Anyway, the slides I prepared were an explanation. Now, this, you need to get into PowerPoint itself. And there you go. Perfect.
I'm going to play with the pencil to see if there's one switch.
Okay.
Okay, that's somebody else's slide.
No, yes. That's
It's actually a good one, by the way. I may want to use that later on.
just a moment.
Okay, there's me. I know what that looks like.
Oh gosh. Okay, well it crashed. I'll be right with you.
Do you need my flash drive again?
Yeah.
Oh, but it should be in your computer.
That's the problem with the PowerPoint.
Okay, the folder's titled NASA.
Okay.
NASA slides. Anyway, while this gets going, I might as well continue giving you some background as to why I got interested in this. We had a chance to do something that nobody could do. It wasn't just getting to the moon. It was the process of developing the ability to get to the moon. You could say, sure, we're going to spend $20 billion and go to the moon, but we're not spending it on in the moon. We're spending it here on Earth. We are doing the steps necessary that Jules Verne couldn't do. And we had the ability to do that. And the people who were literally heroes who said, I'm going to rise to that challenge and make it work. Some of them are in this room, by the way. Some of my NASA colleagues, and I'm very flattered that you guys showed up. But we did something that nobody could dream of. We could only dream of, but we actually did it. And the way we did it, we used a process of management that was developed to make things happen. How do you do that? You end up with an objective, and the objective actually starts on Earth. The objective is to have somebody land safely on Earth. And you work backwards. You take the steps that make that happen. In order to land safely on Earth, you have to have a capsule that can withstand re-entry. You have to have the propulsion that gets someone from the moon to the Earth. You have to have the system that allows someone to take off from the moon. You have to understand, I'm doing this backwards, totally backwards. When you have the end objective in mind, and you have it locked down, then you can work back and fill in the pieces that you need to fill. And some of those pieces went way back to Earth to design telemetry systems, medical monitoring systems, all the things that you need to do, and we would have teams assigned to each of those, and then we put them back together. Are you ready? Mm-hmm. Let's give it a shot. It's still not playing the way it should, but this is good enough. Now, by the way,
I think the problem is with Google Hangouts.
Don't worry about it. This is the, I'm going to use this pointer. I wasn't going to plan this. This is the NASA meatball, right? That's what it's called. NASA's had different logos, but you notice there's a different meatball on the top here. And this is one that was designed by Buzz Aldrin. And for those of you who can't quite really see this, it says, "Get your ass to Mars." All right? Yeah. And I'm sorry it's small, but for those of you who are interested, all right, I have stickers that I can give you that you can put in your car window in the back. If you look at my green van out there with Maine license plates, you'll see this sticker in the window. It is, in my view, the next step that we need to take to not just revise the manned space program for the sake of reviving it, but to put a target for humankind to achieve very similar to what we did on the way to the moon. So these slides I'm going to show you is what we accomplished on the way to the moon. See if you can hit the next slide and see what it looks like. Okay, here we go. Much better. Right? And by the way, here you see Deimos, and here you see Phobos. Phobos is the innermost moon of Mars. Actually, it's this one because it's bigger than the outer moon. It happens to go around Mars 3 times in a Martian day, which if we are going to land a spacecraft on Phobos, it gives us a tremendous advantage. Why? Because the moon's already moving, so we can catch up to it, and we don't have to use that much fuel to brake. And then when it comes around the planet on the other side, we can use that speed as a boost to get back to Earth. So it's a very good vantage point. Plus there's some geological work that I'd like to see done on that moon itself, not just on Mars, to talk about maybe finding out about the origins of the moon itself and maybe the Martian surface. Gives us a great vantage point to view the surface. And I hope this is the next step in a program that will happen. So now, okay, that's an idea, that's a target. How do you achieve it? Well, you have to find out how you're going to get this person back. I want that person to come back alive. There are other, and I'll talk about them in later slides, talking about colonizing the planet itself. Petrov and McKenzie did this, and I'll talk about their study in a little while, because they went into a lot of detail. And I have some of that detail. I'll make it available to you too, by email if you need. So let's go to the next slide. Why NASA? These are all the things that happened as a result of the program itself. Things that wouldn't have happened on their own. Now, fireproof garments maybe did. This guy decided to die on me. Here he goes. Fireproof garments are useful and necessary on Earth. And that's what I mean by spin-offs. The fact that we were able to perfect some of these things means that they could also be used here on the planet. And most firefighters in the world, not just in the United States, use some of the garment technology that was developed as a result of the Apollo program. Same with insulation. Why is it lightweight? That's important. Weight was very important. By the way, I couldn't be an astronaut. Why? Because I was too tall. You had to be lower than a certain stature. I think it was 5'11" or 5'9". Because I figured that an astronaut could have the same kind of brain, but that he wouldn't have all that weight to take up into space. And I have a fair amount of weight. Fascinating, Velcro is one of the things that people, and the spin-offs that went. Let's go to the next slide. Medicine. All these things, the CAT scans, MRIs, were all developed because we needed to find out what the physiological aspects were of astronauts going into space and returning to Earth. We know they have a lot of difficulty, particularly if they're in space for a long time. The remote sensing was very important. Let's go to the next slide. Technology management. This is how we really got to the moon. This work breakdown structure, I kind of hinted on it before. You basically decide what steps you need to take. Some of those are really simple to figure out. Some of them we have not a clue about. They're basically like an empty box, and you have to fill in the boxes and connect all the dots. And you've connected them all, and you have modules and programs that work together. Then you can get to the moon and maybe Mars. Open patents. I actually was personally involved in patent research when I worked at NASA. The fact is, we wanted to have this technology spread. We did not want proprietary information monkeying up with the space program. We had a problem where I worked at College Space Flight Center. We would have NASA contractors on our campus, and it really was like a college campus. They'd talk to the people in the laboratories, and they would run out and patent some of the things that were developed, and then charge NASA royalties for using them. Well, we wanted to stop that, and we did. We said, if you're going to work on NASA, these patents aren't going to be proprietary. You're going to make them available to the world. CPFF, that's cost plus fixed fee and cost plus incentive fee contracts. These are contracts that didn't exist before, but they gave rewards to companies that were able to take these work breakdown structure blocks and complete the contracts that made them possible either ahead of time, and that was the incentive fee, or if we didn't know what it was going to be, we gave them a fixed fee. If they solved it, they got paid for it. It gave industry incentives to do things right. Progress reporting, we didn't quite invent PERT, but we certainly used it. That's program evaluation and review technique. And basically they are Gantt charts and progress charts with charted progress and linked these modules together because some of them depended on the achievement of other modules. And it all had to be coming together. We would report on these things every month and every quarter to make sure that all the managers had an idea of where we were in the program, where we were going. Things had to be changed. KT stands for Kepner-Trago. We had I think a lecture on the Johnson Space Center about a year or two ago. This was a way to solve problems. And we actually used it to solve the Apollo 13 problem. Using, basically, you had all the evidence, all the telemetry data, you had the physical evidence that you had before, but you didn't have it when the when it all crashed into the sea. So investigating that problem was enormous, but it was successful using these techniques. Let's go to the next one. Lots of things involving chemistry that help the space program and help people here on Earth. Plastic wraps, carbon fiber materials, all kinds of advances in metallurgy. Metals react differently when they're in space. We learned a lot about it. Battery development, fuel cell, all the other things that are here were things that we learned. We learned and we did it, and then we shared it with the Russians. And this is an argument that I personally had, not an argument, I shouldn't say that, with Werner von Braun. And I had asked him, hey, we developed our docking systems, beautiful docking systems, and we were about to give it to the Russians. And I said, aren't we giving away our tax dollars? Aren't we giving away our ingenuity? And the answer he gave me personally, he said, Wysmuller, if we have an astronaut in trouble in space, and the Russians have a bird and a launch pad, and they can actually send it up there, all they can do is look through the window and wave. They can't rescue, and we can't be rescued, and we can't rescue them. So we have docking technology that really works well, and we did. And we gave it to them because we wanted to be able to link up. And it was beautiful cooperation. Later on, we had the Soyuz project where the Apollo and the Soyuz linked up in space, and we did a lot of things. And by the way, the reason we gave them our technology is that we weren't really confident the Russians had that nailed down. They really didn't. Their spacecraft were, let's say, to be kind, less robust than ours. And the tolerances weren't as tight. We did ourselves a favor by giving them that technology. Next one. Lots of things happened in the process of going to the moon. Energy management, communication was really, really crucial. All kinds of thermal, this is for re-entry. Physics was really improved. And what we learned in the process of getting to the moon ended up in the textbooks of people in college, which is really, really neat. So the benefits got back here. People got smarter as a result of our program. Go next. Now, why were electronics important? First of all, when the space program started, most of the computer technology relied on vacuum tubes. They were heavy, they were unreliable. The transistor was developed in the early 1950s. We realized we would need that, and we ended up getting microchips, all to save weight. Save weight and improve reliability. And we happened to win on both accounts. Antennas were developed. GPS, by the way, is a result of satellites in orbit that wouldn't be in orbit had we not had the space program. And once we had the satellites in orbit, the military immediately jumped on it and realized that they could position anything very accurately on the planet. And then allowed civilians to use the technology, but they had to have a 2-meter error rate. Anyway, they got rid of that. Now we have very reliable GPS technology that can pinpoint you to the inch anywhere on the world. Imaging systems, photovoltaics are important. Why? Because that's where we got the energy in space. If you look at the International Space Station, you see these giant wings, all with photovoltaics providing energy. And now you see them on farms all over the country and on rooftops. We do it here. It is so-called free energy. It comes from the sun anyway. Household electronics have been improved. Let's go next one. Okay, so here's the next objective. How are you going to get to Mars? All right, next slide. There's Mars, okay? Next slide. We've even named some of the places on Mars. This is courtesy of Sky and Telescope. So some of these names are a little bit, here's Utopia, here's Eden. That's okay, you know, we have mapped the planet nicely, but we need to get there. Next slide, please. This is the Mackenzie and Petrov's vision of what a Mars settlement would look like. Now, Mars settlement means people are going to live there and stay there and die there and have children there and grow there. They decided they want to bury it into one of the hills. They mapped out where on the planet this should be. They want to dig into the hills. Why? Because the radiation exposure is higher on Mars. The atmosphere is much, much thinner and does not protect as well as we are protected here on Earth. For the next slide, this is the ground view, by the way. All right, this is the structure that they have for this settlement, and they have hydroponic greenhouses. There are some flaws here, by the way. Flaws, they relied on nuclear power. Now, nuclear power, as it was developed at the time that Petrov and Mackenzie did their work, required lots of lead shielding. Lead is very heavy. You got to get that lead to Mars. You can't make sure that you're going to find lead on Mars because we don't know yet. So the power management for this particular project needs work. The other thing that they were counting on is digging 50 or 60 feet below the Martian surface to find water. That may or may not happen. We don't know. We haven't found sufficient water yet on Mars. We've dug a little bit into the soil. We may be able to extract some of it from the soil, but we don't know that for sure. And water is also very heavy. If you have a cubic meter of water that we would take in a spacecraft to bring to Mars, a cubic meter is 1 ton. All right? Actually, 2,240 pounds. Talk about a metric ton. All right? It's heavy. We have enough trouble getting water up at the International Space Station. And we're using lots of water management to be able to husband that water. So there are things that need work for this thing to work. The whole document is about 60 to 80 pages. If you want for research purposes, I can send you a copy. Just send me an email at colderside.com, tom@colderside.com. And in the email, tell me that you want to have this for research purposes, and I will send it to you. I don't want to get into copyright problems. NASA funded this research, by the way, and then pulled the plug around 2008. The program itself, the first big hit the program took was in 1972. In 72, I was still with the agency, but they had decided to cancel Apollo 18. The manned space program continued because we had the shuttle program going. But any of our efforts to continue on into deeper space, meaning away from Earth orbit, were put on the back burner. They basically weren't funded. This program that developed this was funded for the research, but we never went further than that. It became politically unpopular. I'm not so sure that the future of mankind should rest on the political whims of people. There are enough people who want to have this work that we can devote sufficient funds to make it happen. And I think we need to do that as a target for the world, not just for Americans. And yes, I'm very, very proud that America was first to set foot on the moon and walk around and even ride a buggy on the moon. And I have some friends of mine who were up there and did it. And that was great. But we have a planet that consists of many nations. some of whom have decent space programs. And I'm thinking of the Russians and the Chinese. The Chinese, at this point, are targeting a manned landing and return from far side. Far side is the portion of the moon that never sees Earth. And there's a good rationale for doing it. Far side is in a radio vacuum in the sense that the TV signals, radio signals that emanate from Earth, and there's a lot. And by the way, we only see in very, very narrow wave bands. If we could see in radio and we could see in microwave, Earth would be a brilliant beacon of all kinds of colors coming out. But we can't see that. But on far side, they are shielded from that, and you can actually look deep into the universe and find things that we just can't see here because of our own electronic pollution. So my hats off for the Chinese for starting it. It's an arduous task. It is very difficult because there will be no real communication unless they put up satellites ahead of time around the moon, and I think that's their target. So once they accomplish that, and they can guarantee they can be in touch with their colleagues on the back of the moon, we should see some neat discoveries coming out of that. But we should be part of it. And I don't think we are cooperating sufficiently with either the Russians or the Chinese. I've learned my lesson. Von Braun taught me my lesson. Right? I think the world needs to get the same lesson. Let's try one more slide. I'm not so sure where that's going to take us.
Those are all the 13.
Is that it? Okay. All right. Obviously, we'll be open for questions later on. These are the benefits that we got as a part of the Apollo program. If we had a Mars program, we would multiply those benefits. We would have to create more technologies, more things that will help people here on Earth. And that is helping people here on Earth and giving them a target, a raison d'etre to do these things, like we have with Apollo. All the other things, all the other spin-offs were a beautiful fringe benefit of that program. And we learned things in the process. We have some real heroes in that program. Some of them in the room right here. There's one of them sitting right here. And the reason I point to Hal is that every astronaut owes his life to Hal. For the program he ran in taking out the resonances and the vibrations of the spacecraft, which would have made them break apart if they weren't managed properly. A lot of people owe you their lives, Hal. I leave it up to you guys to continue the program, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
So, as both Kesha and Tom hit at in different ways, the real issue that we're facing is what is human? And this is something we have to recover today. We have to recover this as an active concept, especially inside the United States, which has come so far down from where we once were in the space program that Tom and others participated in under the leadership of Kennedy. So the issue is, what is human? What is our responsibility as human beings in the universe? We're a unique species, unlike any other. The prime characteristic that you can point to in which we are unique is that, unlike every other species we're aware of, human beings cannot simply be a repetition of the past. Mankind must progress. If we don't make new discoveries, if we don't discover new principles which we can embody in new technologies and new industries, which give us greater power in and over the universe to make things happen which were impossible before. If we don't do this, we will collapse as a species. Now, that truth has profound implications, because what it means is that by design, mankind must constantly be becoming better, becoming more powerful, more capable to shape the planet, the universe beyond. By design, mankind must fulfill that calling as a species. That's profound. Now, when we do this, when we pursue this assigned job, so to speak, mankind has an irreversible effect on the planet. And it's something that no other species or process on the planet can have. For example, mankind has created new minerals which have never existed before the appearance of man on the planet and could never have existed by any other so-called natural process. We've created new materials. Tom described some of them that were created in the manned space program mission. We've created and we've made processes occur under conditions that never could have occurred naturally. For example, the conditions in the inside of a fission reactor, a fusion reactor, cannot occur on this planet except for the action of mankind. So these original creations of man, the fossils of man's mind, these both express and give mankind powers which, as I said before, irreversibly change nature. And it's come to a point now where man's effect on the planet is geologically detectable. Right? Man has raised the biosphere to a level of energy throughput and productivity which the biosphere could not have achieved on its own. We see this in agriculture, in the concentration of biomass and the energy of biomass in all the advanced agriculture. We see this in farming and livestock work and so forth and so on. We see this in the improvements that man has made to plants and animals. Now, this power of mankind overall was recognized by an important scientist who lived in the end of the 19th and first half of the 20th century, Vladimir Vernadsky, who was a Russian-Ukrainian scientist. And he recognized this phenomenon of man's impact on the geology of the planet as the emergence of the noosphere, the emergence of the reshaping and reorganization of the planet due to the processes of reason. Now, that power, that's the fundamental issue at the center of economics. Now, economics is not what most people think it is today. When you ask somebody, you go to a college classroom or you go, down to the Wall Street Stock Exchange or even in your local coffee shop, and you ask somebody, what is economics? What do most people think of? Money. Yeah, money. Balance sheets, accounting sheets, gross domestic product, job counts, market forces. Yeah, right, these kinds of things. That's what you'll hear discussed when you say economics, right? Or import, exports, imports, that kind of thing. You hear, and I always wonder, what does this mean? What do people even understand of this when it's stated? But you'll hear the president or some other administration official say, the economy is strong. This quarter we've experienced economic growth. And I have no idea what's being referred to, right? But as opposed to these, some silly, some inadequate, some fraudulent ideas of economics, real economics, human economics, as discovered by Lyndon LaRouche, as founded in the early 1950s by LaRouche, is a branch of physical science. It's governed according to physical laws, which are knowable to mankind. There is a knowable physics to how mankind can increase his power to exist in the universe and what leads to failure and collapse. Now, this progress cannot be measured in monetary terms. It cannot be measured in terms of, or expressed in terms of market forces. And it certainly can't be expressed in terms of trend lines which is a lot of what you'll hear today in economics discussions. What are the trend lines? Well, the fact is, if mankind is not violating trend lines, if we're not introducing new discoveries which revolutionize what we thought the universe was, and thereby, when embodied in technologies and so forth, revolutionize our power to act, to create things which didn't exist before, to exert powers which we could not have exerted before, and therefore could never have appeared on some chart of market forces. If we're not overturning the knowledge base and the powers of the previous state of mankind, we will collapse. So this process, adding new discoveries, this leads to a discontinuous leap, an increase in the productive powers of labor of every individual involved in the economy. That's the effect of the insight and the knowledge of the mind of mankind. Now, this increase in the productive powers of labor is not something which could have happened by simply doing more of the same, more of the previous kind of work. It's a revolution. Again, Vernadsky recognized this unique role of the individual in the human species, which doesn't occur in any other species of the biosphere. What he pointed to is that man is the only species for whom one individual can have a geological impact. Now, Vernadsky recognized this not only on planet Earth, but also potentially beyond the planet Earth, out into the solar system and the cosmos. Just to reference a quick example, because I think it's important to do so, of an individual whose mind's work left not only a significant impact on the planet, but also beyond, is Johannes Kepler, somebody who lived 400 and something years ago, whose discoveries of the fact that the solar system is a physical system. There's a physical cause to the motions of the planets around the sun. This broke down the barriers between man on Earth and man in the cosmos, and for the first time incorporated man into a physical system of the solar system. So that's the context, that's the foundation upon which I want you to think now, and I want to turn a little bit of attention to two space programs. The first, China, and then we'll come back to the United States. So I'd like just to go through just a little bit of what the Chinese are doing. Mr. LaRouche has pointed to China's space program as one of the leading, as really leading the cause of mankind in the cosmos today. So, the Chinese had experience with missile launches and so forth throughout the 60s and 70s, but it really wasn't until the early 1990s, with the creation of their civilian space agency, that China began their manned space program, the Shenzhou program. In 2003, in October, they launched the Shenzhou 5, launching their first man into space. Now, just to say something about this, and I'll come back to it, 2003, this is right around the time, actually just a few months before the United States announced that we would be returning to the moon, and we would be having our eye on manned spaceflight to Mars. So we'll come back to this, but keep that in your mind of the time frame. If you go to the next slide, this is a video grab of the live feed of the first Chinese spacewalk in 2008 with the Shenzhou 7, which was live broadcast back to Earth. In 2012, if you go to the next slide, the Chinese both sent up the first segment of their space station, or the first phase of their space station, which was shortly followed by a crew to, for the first time, both automatically and manually dock with the space station and enter it. And they sent this video back to Earth. You go to the next one. A year later, in 2013, the second crew rendezvoused with the space station segment, entered the space station, and their second female astronaut here, Wang Yiping, gave a physics class to 60 million Chinese children who were waiting in their classrooms on Earth. In the early 2020s, the Chinese expect to have finished the construction of their space station, their full-size space station, which is a little bit smaller than the ISS. This is a schematic of a possible organization of it. The Chinese want this to be truly an international effort, and they've invited not only astronauts from the United States, from Europe, and other spacefaring nations to be trained to participate in the space station, but they've also invited nations who don't have a spacefaring capability, nations of other parts of Asia and so forth, to be trained in the Chinese program to participate in this research. Now, just to say, this is around the time that the ISS is expected to be decommissioned. Okay, so moving on, in 2004, just to go back in time a little bit, a year after the first man was launched into space, China began its lunar program. And this was the dream of an important space pioneer in China, Ouyang Zhiyuan, who was really a leading force for the establishment of the lunar program. Now, 3 years later, in 2007, in October, China launched its first mission to the moon, the Chang'e 1, which successfully entered lunar orbit and made a high-resolution 3D mapping of the moon and began to map the mineral resources of the surface. Now, at that time, a few days before the launch, a newspaper interviewed 10,000 Chinese students. And of those 10,000, 99% were closely following the lunar program. 99%. 90%, 9,000 of those 10,000 believe probably that they will one day travel to the moon. Now, just a few years later, people might remember the news broadcasts of this. The Chang'e 3 made the first soft landing on the moon of anybody in nearly 40 years. Putting down a lunar lander and this beautiful, you can go to the next slide, this beautiful lunar rover, the U-2 lunar rover, which is not just a repetition of what the United States and the Russians have done in the past. This lunar rover has ground scanning capability, which can see 100 meters down into the below the lunar surface. The lander has a UV telescope on it, which sent back, if you go to the next slide, an image of the Earth's plasmasphere taken in the ultraviolet. If you go to the next slide, just less than a year after that, the Chang'e 5T1 completed an orbit around the backside of the moon, returned to Earth orbit, and sent a capsule returning from the moon to the Earth, which again was the first time this has happened in over 40 years. And this is in preparation for their 2017 sample return mission. So you can go to the next slide, you can see the next two slides, I think. You can see the Chinese scientists recovering the successfully landed space capsule. Now, Tom mentioned this. If you go to the next slide. In 2018, the Chinese planned to land on the far side of the moon, which is incredibly exciting. This is not an unknown part of the moon's personality. The far side has been drawing the curiosity of people for quite some time. And in fact, the astronaut Harrison Schmitt, was pushing, before they were canceled, was pushing for at least one of the last 3 Apollo missions to land on the far side. Now, so you can look, just to say a few things about this, the near side and the far side are actually quite different. And I expect when we land there, we may find out that they're even more different. We might find more surprises to find out that they're even more different than we can tell so far. If you just look at it, the far side is much more heavily cratered. It has almost no lunar maria, which are these more flat, smooth regions formed by more recent volcanic activity. Those are some of the visual obvious differences. There are other differences. For example, we suspect that the lunar far side has a higher concentration of the rare element helium-3, which is an important fusion fuel, which will give mankind an entry into becoming a much more powerful species in terms of our control over fusion power. The other aspect of the far side, which is very exciting, which Tom mentioned, is the prospect for very low frequency radio astronomy. the Earth blocks, it's impossible to make these kind of observations from anywhere near the Earth in Earth orbit or the lunar near side. But by putting down very low frequency radio observatories on the far side, for which there are some interesting designs, at least the designs seem pretty ready to go, we may be able to image the universe in a way which we have never ever been able to image it before. And if you go to the next slide, I want to give you an example of what I mean, what we might expect. This is an image of the Hercules A galaxy. Now, the Hercules A galaxy, if we look at it with an optical telescope, what we'll see is that fuzzy blob in the middle. So that's all we knew of the Hercules galaxy. Then we looked at it in the radio frequency, actually studying this as a composite of 4 different wavelengths of radio frequency. And all of a sudden, we see these structures being emitted from the Hercules galaxy, which dwarf the size of the galaxy, which are plasma jets and other kinds of activity, which were invisible to us until we peered in a different wavelength. This is the kind of thing that may be revealed to us when looking in a wavelength in which we've never been able to see the universe before. So the far side of the moon holds a tantalizing potential for mankind to begin to open up more of these unknowns, which are completely inaccessible to us at the current moment. From there, I just want to return briefly to the United States. You can go to the next slide. As people probably know, in 2004, in January, President Bush announced that the United States would be returning men to the moon, and we would use the technologies developed, the knowledge developed, and so forth as a test bed for then going on to put people on Mars. Now, around that time, it was either 2004, 2005 or so, there was an international conference of lunar scientists who recognized at the time that the United States, the Chinese, the Europeans, and the Russians, and maybe there were others, had plans to go to the moon. And right away, this conference put out a resolution proposing that we have complete cooperation among these space agencies to pool our resources, to pool our knowledge, and make this achievement in an accelerated time frame. In February of that year, February 2004, NASA released a document called A Vision for Space Exploration, which lays out in summary form a very carefully charted plan for how we were going to get people from the Earth to the moon to Mars, laying out the time frames, the different stages, and so forth. And the idea was that we would land men on the moon at the latest by 2020, and by the earliest, 2015. This would be, preparations would be made by a series of robotic lunar landings to begin around 2008. And what began at NASA was a real mobilization to regain, number one, regain what was lost with the cancellation of Apollo. Regain, or really reassemble or assemble teams, which had been lost when people like Tom were, laid off of NASA, others were laid off. We lost those teams that had built up capabilities, not just knowledge, but capabilities to work together to figure things out. The infrastructure was lost. So NASA mobilized to begin rebuilding this, but from the standpoint of everything we've learned in the intervening decades, new technologies, things we've learned with the shuttle program, things we've learned by having people spend extended periods of time in space, new materials technologies. So what was involved is, just to give a quick summary, what was to be involved was the development of a new space launch system, or a new launch system, the Atlas rockets. So on the left here, you see the Saturn V, which is the heavy lift rocket of Apollo. You see the space shuttle with the booster rockets there. And then you see the Ares rockets, the Ares 1, which was to carry crew into low Earth orbit. And you see the Ares 5, which was to carry cargo, including the lunar lander and everything else they would need. You can go to the next slide. Another thing that was under development was a new lunar lander, the Altair lunar lander, which was to be larger than the Apollo era lunar lander. This one carried up to 6 people. It was to have more cargo capacity. And the other thing that was under development, another thing under development was a new crew capsule, the Orion crew capsule, which again was going to be able to carry a lot more people. I think that went also up to 6 people. The other thing that was under development was the need for nuclear power systems and propulsion systems, which were recognized as being necessary to get men to Mars. And there was a program that was folded in to this new mobilization called Project Prometheus, which had actually been underway since 2003 to develop nuclear propulsion, a nuclear-propelled rocket, which was unfortunately canceled in 2005. Now, this was the mission. We were supposed to have men on Mars by 2030, and there was a whole plan for that, which I don't have time to go through. Now, this mission, when I was reading through this document, I was actually struck, and I kind of felt silly for not thinking about it, but I was struck by the fact that the declaration of this mission, the commitment of the US to this mission, actually started to reorganize everything that NASA was doing into one common effort and one common direction. So for example, the New Horizons mission that just flew by Pluto recently, this had already been planned. But by 2004, when this new program was created, we knew we were going to launch New Horizon. But things like New Horizon were now folded into the directionality that we had to go explore the solar system. There were other robotic missions which have since been launched, or some of them canceled, but had been planned at the time. Everything now was being vectored into a common effort, a common mission for accomplishment. And so work got underway. Now people probably realize that we didn't land men on the moon in 2015. The Constellation program, which was the manned portion of this, was canceled with the fiscal year 2011 budget of the administration, and what was frankly a brutal and irresponsible declaration that Constellation was over budget, behind schedule, and lacked innovation. Right? So.
Wow.
It was obviously not paying off the right politicians.
Right. Yeah, and of course it was announced by President Bush, but it wasn't funded by President Bush or the Congress and so forth. And that's a whole discussion to have. Why didn't this work? Who was against it? Who stopped it? Who, and I can tell you who, outlawed cooperation with the Chinese, with bilateral cooperation between NASA and the Chinese. Who did this, right? Those things are all true, and they are worth taking in and knowing. But the thing I want to highlight here is the incredible capability that still exists. The optimism, like that, the kind of optimism, the kind of electricity that you saw in NASA, that you saw a little bit in the population already. Now, one thing I'll point to is that this year, actually just less than a month ago, just a couple of weeks ago, despite the fact that we've actually come a long way down, even since the cancellation of the Constellation program, 18,300 young Americans applied to be an astronaut. It's incredible. That's triple the number, more than triple the number of people who applied in 2012. So so it's there. The potential is there. We have to revive it. And I'll just end with this. Think about the prospects we have today. This financial system is finished. The Wall Street system is finished. The control over the world economy of this grouping is finished. There is a new paradigm that has emerged in the world of leadership for the common aims of mankind. It's typified by China and their Silk Road program, their program for win-win cooperation development. It's typified by the efforts of people like President Putin in Russia, the kind of development programs that you see extending into Southeast Asia, extending into Africa, and so forth. This is the new paradigm. Since this program for cooperation was first proposed in 2004 and then canceled, think about how far the Chinese have come since then. Think about even the increased capability since last time we tried to get this going that exists within mankind. The Chinese now have a concrete program to land on the far side of the moon. That's an advancement in mankind. Now, so just to sort of wrap it up, I think you think through all of these, the potential before us. The Chinese are going to land on the far side of the moon. they have concrete plans for the utilization of helium-3, even though we haven't figured out the fusion technology yet to use it. They are confident that we will. This use of helium-3 will transform mankind. The fact that it's been discovered on the moon has already transformed mankind and mankind's actions. The Chinese have a vision, but between now and 2030, and they've laid out a certain stage-by-stage plan. Whether it happens by 2030 or not is not the issue. They have a plan for the exploration of the moons of Jupiter, of Saturn's moon Titan. They have an idea of exploring parts of the asteroid belt. They have an idea of investigating the cause of coronal mass ejections and things we don't yet understand about the sun. NASA has very similar plans. So does the European Space Agency. So those things stand before us, but the point I just want to leave you with is that it's not even the specifics that are really important. I mean, they are important. You got to know what steps you're going to take, but the more crucial point here is, what are we looking at with this mission? You're looking at the creation and the development of mankind. That's the goal. That's the ultimate mission. Science is not what most people think it is, just like economics. Science is not the, tripping over a new fact. It's not the addition of, another knowledge nugget to your bag, like a squirrel collecting nuts. That's not science. Science is mankind's creation of a new discovery about the universe, which really, in a certain way, is also a new discovery about mankind itself. This redefines the universe. When man acts on his discoveries, we redefine the universe. We create new powers that didn't exist. And I think that power of mankind, is really what we have to be determined to instill into the United States today now. That's the political victory. That's what we want by winning this political fight today. So I think I will leave it at that. And yeah, take questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Megan and Tom. I hope our audience here has been thoroughly inspired. I'm going to take some questions in just a moment. And but as Megan was speaking, one thing that just really struck me is what happened to the creative imagination of our society. And I was reading a report, a book review that was done recently in Executive Intelligence Review about the book and the life of Homer Hickam, that actually he wrote a book called The Rocket Boys about his life growing up in West Virginia and how the launching of Sputnik and his thrill with that and the ability that he was able to get himself out of the conditions of, oh, all you're going to be is like, you can't do anything except have a football scholarship. That's the only way you're going to work your way up, or, the only way you're going to be something great is, you just have to go into coal mining. There's no way out. You have parts of society where it's no way out. People don't have the ability to be creative. I mean, that's whether it's looking at McDowell, West Virginia area, or looking at the areas where you have people who have, turned to drugs and suicide, the inner city areas where people haven't been given the opportunity to look up at the stars and wonder and be creative and to have an imagination. You think about that, that's what NASA did. That's what the space program and that intention of what it represented, that mankind, human beings, could be anything that they wanted to be if they put their minds to it And I mean, you think about, speaking of Krafft Ehricke earlier, and Krafft Ehricke got inspired by Herman Oberth, the space pioneer, rocket, rocket engineer and driver, and who put forth the movie Woman in the Moon, Frau im Mond, I think is what it's called in German. And it was interesting because I was telling somebody recently that I was watching this, and it's a black and white movie, which is it's black and white, and it's silent. It's a silent film. And one thing is that you really have to have, what it invokes in people is, you know, a sense of the creative imagination, looking beyond what is presented there, but what you're seeking to create, where we can be going. And so it's very inspiring. And I think that's what we need today, is the question of how do we inspire a nation? How do we inspire a people again to have that sense that we have to go far and beyond what mankind thinks it is capable of creating, and create even greater destinies for mankind. So with that, I will stop there with my comments and open it up for questions, because let's let you know, while we're talking about going to the moon and organizing vacuum tubes and everything to get us rapidly to the moon and Mars, we need to figure out how to get people rapidly around Houston. Exactly. For those who are listening to this, it took like 3 hours for people to just, and I commend every one of you who came here, because they closed down the freeways here, and it was taking people hours to get here. So we're going to get those high-speed rail systems going. Okay, so let me go ahead and open up for questions. And are we taking questions online?
None yet.
Okay, so we'll open up for questions here, and if people have some questions online, I think you have to email it in. Maybe you know how to do that.
They can post it on the YouTube.
Post it on the YouTube page. Okay, yes, sir.
One thing, from my point of view, the main problem in this is politicians. They've got these little things going where they're making their money, they're making their power, but whether or not it results in anything worthwhile beyond them winning the next election, they're not interested. Let's just say that I was terribly surprised to hear about helium-3 on the backside of the moon.
Oh.
But frankly, the Chinese worry me, but the thing growing is that our people up at the top are what you'd call terribly short-sighted, and half the problem we have with what people are going to do is that they put in something. We're going to educate the children. We're going to, what was that thing called, Common Core?
Oh, yeah.
And I've run into kids who don't know diddly compared to what I knew when I was in elementary school. And I'm laying that all at the feet of people who get elected for this or that.
Well, I'll make a comment on that, and then if others would like to, I mean, that's why we're here today. And the idea of statesmanship really doesn't exist amongst these so-called political echelons, political networks, because really, since the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, we have gone toward a rapid degeneration of our society. And, you know, we've seen, Megan and I and some of my younger colleagues in this room here have seen this rapid degeneration and have been denied access to a future because we weren't able to participate in the vision, per se, that Kennedy laid out. And mean, that's why it's so important right now. What Megan said, that, you know, I don't know the age groups of all the people who registered to become astronauts, but I'm sure there were mostly young people, 18,000 people, 18,300, you know, individuals. But like you said, it has to start from a mission orientation from the top. So our leaders have to actually care about the progress of where we're going. And that's why we're here, because we have to demand that. And that's why I ran for political office, because I demanded that, and why I continue to fight. So I think that what we just presented here today should give you a sense of optimism that they don't run the show. We need people to stand up and fight.
They stopped the show. That's the problem.
Well, not for long, because as Megan said at the end of her presentation here, that the system that of Wall Street, the money system, or what people think constitutes, you know, real progress in the economy, is gonna no longer exist. It's coming down. Unless people get with the program and recognize that we are going for a new direction, new paradigm for mankind, where people are no longer going to be degraded as little bestial people, but that we can actually have a commitment once again to what our intention, recognized in our Constitution, recognized in our Declaration of Independence, recognized in the preamble. And that's what we're talking about right now. So there is a period for optimism. There is a moment right now that people should be optimistic, especially looking at that brilliant direction that China is putting forward. And that, as said, we can't be left behind. We have to participate in that. Okay.
Kesha, got to chime in a little bit?
Yes.
Come on up.
You can say that.
Here.
Oh, please.
One of the things in your question that bothered me a little bit is that you said you were worried about the Chinese. That doesn't bother me at all. The Chinese are human beings like we are. They have to be developing technology that we could have helped them with, but chose not to. And yes, maybe you can learn from two parallel efforts, or add the Russians in there, three parallel efforts. But we really need to work with each other in these goals as human beings over the entire planet. I'm very proud of the American space program. We achieved great things, but we stopped. And there was no reason to stop. Now, stopping is an over-exaggeration. There were a lot of things that we were doing here at Johnson Space Center, which were continued well after the end of the Apollo era. The astronaut management and the shuttle program and all those things were good, but we did it without really involving the Chinese. We basically forced them to go at it alone. That shouldn't have happened. It really shouldn't have happened. If we gave our docking technology to the Russians, we could have given a lot of other technologies to the Chinese. Now, there was a real concern that we would be giving them, quote, access to missile technology and things like that. But the fact is, they had that anyway. We knew that. This was nothing that we invented and had a lock on.
My problem basically is dealing with politicians. I think ours here are, we won't go into that. And the problem is that I don't know where the Chinese politicians are now between what's that boy that runs North Korea and where they had been before, and which and coming in our direction. Well,
you're talking about a focus on weaponry, which is different.
Totalitarian states, although we're rapidly working on being one.
Well, we've been one, John. I'm sorry.
Well, if you focus on weaponry and defense systems, yes, I can understand that. But what the Chinese are doing to get to lunar far side is something that we could be and should be working together on. and they're doing it on their own. I much rather would have seen when that Chinese astronaut lectured to 60 million people on Earth, that there would be simultaneous translation, and we would have that here. But that didn't happen.
I need an update. I think is probably correct.
That's right. Well, I think we need to work with each other as opposed to against each other. Now, you're running this, and you pick the people who are going to answer.
Go ahead. Yes. Yes, you.
Yeah, I very appreciate the opportunity to come here. I almost missed this. I think I'm very excited to hear Tom and Megan talk about the Chinese program in the U.S. My question is, what do you think the root cause? Because Megan mentioned that we have, we don't really have lack of enthusiasm on space program. A lot of people want to be astronauts. There's a lot of people want an interest in space program. And why the United States has been cutting program after program after program, and we are not really. It's because there's a lack of interest, enthusiasm from the politician. What are the root cause? I think I want to just. I think I have an answer, but I want to just stir up the pot a little bit. Let's see. What's the cause?
Well, if you recall those slides I showed, there were all the benefits that were developed as a result of the Apollo program. I don't think people understand that you're going to get a laundry list just as big from developing a Mars program. They're looking for the immediate payout. What am I going to get tomorrow afternoon as a result of this? And that's not going to happen. We didn't even know ahead of time what we were going to develop, but we knew that we were going to discover these technologies in the process of getting there. It was the process that was more important than the objective. The objective was to land a guy on the moon and bring him back. But the processes what created all the benefits. And that's the part that people don't understand. And politicians, I'm afraid, are a little bit too short-sighted and don't want to go to the trouble of educating the public. Hey, by the way, things are going to happen and we don't know what they are yet. But look at what happened before, we can do it again. That message needs to resonate. And I can get excited about it. And I'm out of the program now. I'm long an ex-NASA person, even though I still enjoy coming down here and reigniting those friendships.
Why we were able to spend so much money and went to the moon with our photo program, so much success, and we just, looks like right now it's remotely not even possible to put people back in the moon. The kind of, I think it's an economic problem.
You're right, but every one of those dollars was spent here on Earth, developing things on Earth that we're using on Earth. People always say, well, you put $20 billion up on the moon. No, we didn't. Here's where it ended up. Okay.
Well, also, you think about what, the problem is Wall Street. That's the problem. And did everybody in America support the Apollo mission in the 1960s? No. You had tremendous leadership and legacy of President Kennedy. But that aside, there are a lot of myths that are promulgated out there about Apollo. Like the idea that, by the end of the 1960s and early 70s, people had totally lost interest in the dress mission. They didn't even show policies. They were policies. They were imposed. In 1971, Richard Nixon took the dollar off of gold. The financial system was completely subverted, and the Bretton Woods system was killed. And we went for what's now turned today into the biggest financial swindle bubble of all history. That's what that policy, that paradigm, is what killed the space program. Now, within that, short-sighted politicians absolutely flicked their part. They went lockstep, but that's the problem. And we're at the point now where, as Kesha said, the Wall Street system is over one way or the other. Now, we might go down with it. That's one possibility, but we're trying to fight to make sure that that doesn't happen and that we join what actually is happening in the world. So, that's really the issue. There's just a lot of potential demoralization when you begin to say, well, maybe people really aren't excited about space. No, they are. And that's why the program was canceled, not because it wasn't valuable or that people didn't want it, because there was a policy to shut it down. across the board.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we live in a total false paradigm reality bounded by faux science, fake history, filtered news, financed by fiat currency, and directed by demonic warlords. I'm a retired civil engineer. 7 years ago, I started researching about the global warming fraud and related science frauds.
Let me ask you, I'm sorry,
Yes.
sir, can you direct a question to the speakers, or, because we will have some time afterwards for additional
Well, I'll be
presentations.
afterwards. We'll have a class. I'll show you everything. Global warming, green energy, peak oil,
The
Big
class
Bang,
is
and
right
everything
now.
you know about history. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes,
My question is, I guess directed kind of at Tom too. So, you know, I've worked in the technology sector, and I know the problems with patents, right? So you have technology giants like Google, Apple, who basically are having patent wars where they're not spending any money on development whatsoever. I mean, they're using the money to buy up other companies, right, that are developing things. They're like, okay, we own you now. So we're hoarding all this technology, and then when you use their technology, God help you, because you have to, you know, buy the technology. And then once you're in that technology, you have to keep buying from them, and they keep raising rates. That's one question. And then the other question is going on the military. You know, there's
Hey,
billions of
let me get the
dollars.
first question first. Okay?
Okay.
I'll give you a shot in a second. But patents have evolved since I was involved with them enormously. We didn't have process patents in those days, but now you have process patents. And now you have patent trolls who actually go out and try to wrap around existing technology and claim it for themselves. And all a patent does is gives you the legal right to prevent someone else from doing the same thing without compensation. And if you can get a broad-based patent that covers lots of technologies, you have a lock on it. And you're right, they do hoard it. The legal system for patents has to be looked at. The right person to answer that question is probably a lawyer. And I'm not one of them, right? But the fact that the patents have put a stranglehold on some development is a problem that we as a society have to try to fix. So now go to your second question.
And the other quick thing, and I'm sorry, I know there's other people waiting. It's more directed towards you. So the Department of Defense has been known to lose billions of dollars of money. And so we're talking about innovation. So supposedly we're developing technology with that money for the safety and security of the United States against, you know, foreign enemies, whatever that may be. So in this whole process of what we're talking about, how should the United States approach be as far as releasing these technologies to share those without risking, you know, letting that technology in the wrong hands?
letting that, you said, get into the wrong hands,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right. Well, I think that's the nature of what we have done with the space program, from the standpoint of the benefit, the mutual benefit of all. And so, yeah, there's maybe risk of that, but when you think about the fact that we have worked with Russia and worked with Russia in developing the International Space Station and going to the International Space Station and so forth, or we work with these other nations. But I think the main point is you have to get to what is the common aims of mankind. And this is something that our organization has been working on for many decades now, going back to the role of economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche working with the Reagan administration, and Reagan adopting the policy of the Strategic Defense Initiative, and what that did in terms of you had a concept that nations, instead of going through a mutually assured destruction policy, a policy that was going to launch weapons at each other, the solution was, how do you actually develop new technologies, shared technologies, where everybody can benefit from it? That was really the idea that Kennedy had, is that we had to look at what actually united us as nations versus those things that divided us as nations. And I mean, once you look at that, then all of the other things sort of become less of a frightening task. But right now, we're being divided as nations because of the militarization, the drive toward thermonuclear war, which a lot of past military leaders and current military leaders are recognizing is the direction that we're headed down right now. So the point is that there has to be a re-emergence of how do we unite nations? How do we, each nation will benefit from these shared technologies. And if we can do that, then no nation can have an upper hand on the other nation, but we're going to share it for the common benefit of each nation. So I think that's what we have to look at right now. Otherwise, if we're all sitting here saying, oh, I can't trust that nation because they're going to do this to me. But the problem is that, as people have already said, when you have a direction that's being promoted by the current administration and others who want to see mankind destroyed, then it makes people a little bit nervous. So we should end that policy. You had your hand up. So.
Oh, I think this is from Megan. I believe it was Representative John Culbertson that got the law through that NASA cannot do any cooperation with China. So how do we get him unelected? How do we re-elect him? How do we get some other congressmen from other states? What networking? I mean, let's hear some ideas here, because apparently he's a thorn in this cooperation. And just the other day,
You sure is my
He has
former
two
congressman,
comments.
1 second.
my former congressman Frank Wolf, who it was Culbertson and Frank Wolf, and luckily Frank Wolf is out of there. My answer is going to be very brief. Work with our movement. I mean, Kesha is heading up operations here in Texas, and we really need to organize the population to support this. If we do this, knuckleheads in the Congress are going to lose their funding and fall out of office, or they're going to be forced to go along with a better idea. But I don't know, Kesha, if you want to say something more specific, but I mean, work with us. We're organizing that movement to overturn the policy directionality of the nation, and idiots like Culbertson are either going to get out of there or have to go along.
Yeah. That's right.
Can you get it?
Yes.
My question is for the gentleman, distinguished gentleman from NASA. Do you think that it is deliberate policy in some quarters to suppress new technologies? I mean, in favor of vested interests? Have you seen that operating during your tenure in NASA and after that?
Well, okay, number one, I am far from distinguished. The record straight. And I don't answer questions to which I don't know the answer. And the fact is, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether we've suppressed it or not. I really don't know. There are maybe other people in this room, former colleagues who might. I'm not one of them. I'm sorry.
You and then.
Mr. Wysmuller, I wanted to ask you more about this, what you know of the interrelationship between the United States and Russia's space program, which I find very ironic in a certain way, because we are today, now with all the anti-Russian stuff that's out in the media, we're constantly blaming Russia for everything, and yet everything we do with the space station is launched on a Russian space vehicle, and in your experience in NASA, we were working with the Russians, that was in the Cold War.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about what the ironies that had to exist in what was going on in the public and then what the space agency was seeing instead.
Well, somebody with better vision than I had, okay, ended up choosing me and 9 other people for this executive intern program. They got me because I had a mathematics background, a meteorological background, and I was going for a master's in international law. And that combination was attractive to the agency. And I think they saw the future possibility of international cooperation. Now, in my naivete, I said, don't give them the document technology, but I was wrong. All right, and I saw the benefits of it. International cooperation had to happen. We knew it had to happen, and I ended up being a very big fan of it. Now, we are, I think, paying the Russians $100 million per astronaut that we send up to the International Space Station. We used to send up a shuttle for a little bit over 200 million. If you add salaries, maybe a little bit more. And we could get up to 8 people up there, and cargo and payload. The jobs that used to be performed here are now being performed in Russia, and using your tax dollars to pay for them. So for a stopgap, yes, great. Now we can actually get Americans back. And the analogy I use to some people when I talk about it, it's like you own an island and then you sink the rowboat that gets you out there. And that's what we've done. We are trying to reignite the capability ourselves of getting people up there. And I think we will within a couple of years. But we're a far shot away from anything approaching a return to the moon. And in order to do that, I think we have to work with the Chinese. And if there is a legal impediment, I think we need to remove it. We're doing all right with the Russians because they have the capability of getting our people up there. But I think we need to do an awful lot more. And the military aspects of revealing information about targeting and things like that, they're gone. There's no more impediment. We've removed the impediments. Each of these countries has the capability of sending missiles to the other. That might have been the motivation for not working with the Chinese before, but it is long gone. And I'd love to see our country, as an example, say we will cooperate. We will make the open patent process available to the rest of the world. Now, you notice the Chinese haven't done that to us. The cooperation is not a two-way street anymore. Why? Because we shut down the street. We need to open it. Enough said. You got to pick them.
Oh, he was next.
Yeah, it's for you.
It is.
I think the issue that you brought up about the facts and the truth around how much wealth was created from the space program.
It's huge, huge.
That issue, I think, is the core issue that has to be, and the fraud that has gone into the population's minds to not understand that issue. So I think my question is, how do we actually communicate that better to the population of the United States so they see what the reality is?
Superb question. I'll tell you what, about 4 years ago, I talked to a guy in the Department of Commerce, and he said to me, about 1 out of every 5 jobs in this country is directly related or dependent upon technology that was developed in the space program. I think he was wrong. I think it's about every other job, all right? And if you look back at, and I can pull my cell phone from my pocket, and everybody's got pocket computers. Yeah. That was all that was developed as a result of the initiatives that our country took in the space program. Now, the fact is these cell phones are all being manufactured in China now, all right?
Yeah.
But the technology was developed here, and it has now become global. That's win-win for everybody. Everybody wins here. So probably every job in this country is touched by it. Other than the guy using, even the fellow digging a ditch is using a shovel that has titanium hardening on the front that was developed as a metallurgical offshoot in the space program. Yeah. Think about that.
And where he digs the ditch is GPS.
Excellent. All right.
I'd like to comment on your question. Many of us that started out on the Apollo program feel like NASA is adrift That's a term used by one of our local heroes of the program. We're not happy with where NASA's going. And Tom wants to go to Mars, and I can talk to leaders here in the past and say, we shouldn't be talking about Mars because there is no budget that supports it. But in trying to decide what should NASA be doing, I've realized that this discussion today has helped. We have to ask ourselves some more basic questions. What is it that we as a nation want to achieve with our space program? Mm-hmm. You've kind of talked about this issue. One of the things as voters we need to decide, do we want to be the leading spacefaring nation on Earth, or do we rather make spacefaring a joint effort of all these nations on Earth? We need to answer that question first. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure how everybody in this room would answer that question. In my experience, I grew up as a teenager in the 50s, and we were all taught about fallout shelters, and we were in this death struggle with the Russians in the Cold War. And we got a lot of propaganda about fearing the Russians, and all of that led to the Apollo program. The Apollo program was really to catch up with the Russians. They were ahead of us in space technology. And so I kind of felt like the Chinese are going to move out ahead of us, and at some point somebody's going to say, we got to catch up with the Chinese, and we'll have it. That's one way. But then I had this interesting experience of after fearing the Russians, President Clinton made this decision, which I didn't agree with at the time, that we're going to build the space station with the Russians. And, I'd been working on a different design for 3 or 4 years, and I said, this is back to square one. But that experience of working with the Russians, and I was working in the structural area of space station, where we're going to join stuff together, and you had to cooperate. And the friends I've made in Russia, and eating dinner in their home and having them come eat dinner in my home, all of that fear I had as a teenager about the Russians disappeared. I can remember the last time they heard it. Neither of us liked the way our leaders were reacting to each other. but people, we share a lot of ideals. So there are a bunch of engineers in Russia I've hired in a minute, because they're very competent. So I've kind of come full circle about, we ought to be the leading spacefaring nation on Earth, and really see that the cooperation approach. But I don't think you've sold that to the American people. You need to ask the voters that basic question.
Yeah, but Hal,
I think that's
we
right.
have expertise here that doesn't exist in China.
China can buy anything they need to do what they want to do.
No, it's not a question of buying it. It's the
They don't have
fact
to
is,
buy it from us.
it makes sense for us to help them achieve it, because they can help us achieve it too.
Help each other achieve
That's
it,
right.
because that's what China just offered. It's called a win-win strategy of cooperation, and I think what you just laid out is absolutely the direction we need to be going in. The Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative, and what they're doing and developing around the world. I mean, this is not China trying to get an upper hand or say, we're developing all these nations so we can control everything. Not a, trying to remember what you call it. It's, not a just one nation controlling everything.
Unipolar?
Unipolar. But we need multipolar cooperation and development. And I mean, that's what we have to move toward right now. And I think what you just said is absolutely the thing that we as Americans need to start to recognize and fight for.
Let me mention three things that have changed since the Apollo program that constrict this free exchange of technology. One thing came out of the Commerce Department called export technology laws. We are not allowed, as Americans or American companies, to export technology to any other country in the world unless our Commerce Department and State Department approve it. For example, Boeing had a launch system where they launched rockets out in the ocean, which is convenient. They could move that to wherever they wanted to launch to get to the right area. They happened to park that. It was a former offshore drilling. They parked it in Australia, and they got this enormous fine from our government for exporting that technology to Australia. That's one thing you got to look at. That's come in since the Apollo program. The other is the ITAR regulations, which is the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, and where there was hardly anything in the Apollo program that was confidential. The only thing I knew in Apollo that was confidential was how much mass we could land on the moon, because that would tell an enemy how much a warhead could weigh that we could launch on the Saturn V. Nowadays, NASA has what's called sensitive but unclassified. And I consult to the Marshall Space Flight Center. I can't even send them an email because it's all sensitive but unclassified. It's essentially classified.
Just use Hillary's stuff.
I'm just saying these are things that have come into our political system since Apollo that effectively shut down the sharing of technology that was Kennedy's vision.
Yes, true. I'm going to take
one little question. It's based on the flyer I mentioned, the Carrington Event of 1859. Would anybody like to address that particular event and enlighten me, about its significance to the current discussion? And
It's a big solar flare, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not an expert, but I will say something.
And asteroid defense, as long as.
Yeah, in 1859, there was an enormous CME, coronal mass ejection, which hit the Earth, which is now called the Carrington Event. If something like that hit us today, our electrical system, or our electrical power system, would basically be wiped out. And the problem is that manufacturing has shut down such that the only nation really which builds the kind of large transistors that we would need to rebuild the thing is Korea. And they have an X number, I don't know, year waiting list on these things. So it is a real danger, and it's something which is recognized by a lot of people, including in the Congress and so forth. But it does bring up the larger issue of planetary defense. And this common thing we've been hitting at in a lot of ways, which is that there are threats to the planet which are not geopolitical. We're really moving beyond the time of geopolitics. There are common threats to mankind against which we can and must cooperate to meet, such as addressing what actually protecting our infrastructure from CMEs. We could be hit by one any day, and in fact CMEs as large or larger than the Carrington Event have occurred but just haven't hit Earth. And the other thing is asteroids, the threat of asteroids. I mean, China recognizes this. The US actually just set up a new office in NASA, I think, or raised its status, forgetting some of the details, for planetary, or for defense against asteroids. And Russia has called for cooperation with the United States in the tradition of the SDI, proposing an SDE, Strategic Defense of Earth, to work together to protect the Earth against threats to the entire globe. And anyway, so that's, to answer your question, that's the significance.
Let me get one more thing added to that. And the Carrington Event is dangerous because if such an event would happen again, the United States or Russia or China or anybody else might interpret it or misinterpret it as an EMP pulse that was launched by some other nation and then react accordingly. And that is very worrisome. There was a good news part of it. Solar activity has begun to diminish in a very, very sharp way. So the likelihood of a Carrington event is probably less and less as each year goes by. But that doesn't eliminate the possibility of a mistake. And it's the mistakes that worry me. Yes, sir.
If you get a chance, there's 2 places you need to visit if you want to talk about the threats from outer space. Every once in a while, they open up Trinity site at White Sands, and you can go see that. And frankly, the desert's back. It's been 70-odd years, but the desert's back. People are living now in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But if you go west from there, a couple of 100 miles, you'll get to Meteor Crater, Arizona, or the Barrington Meteor thingy, or whatever you call it. The guesstimate is that a piece of metal about 150 yards across hit there somewhere between 50 and 10,000 years ago. The hole is still there. It is 4,000 feet wide. It is 400 feet deep. You want to take your kids to educate them on what a meteor strike is like. That's nice, because on that one you can see the far side. There are several around where you can't see the far side, and then there is that one 800-mile cross one in Yucatan that's supposed to have killed off the dinosaurs. So the thing is that nukes are all the way, and politicians can get up on them, but asteroid strikes make me a lot more nervous.
Yeah, I had a question. I'm pretty impressed by all the knowledge in the room from the work that NASA's done and the people who have contributed to it. And because it's not just knowledge for the sake of knowledge, but it's knowledge with the mission. And oftentimes what I hear when I've tried to talk to some of the folks who work with NASA or around it is a deep cynicism about the government and about budgets especially. But here we have the people who are perhaps some of the most qualified to make policy, not just for the country, but for the future of mankind, in the tradition that everyone here is kind of recognizing we have to move towards, the win-win tradition. So the question I have is for anyone who wants to, the 3 of you wants to answer it, is how do we get the scientific community to be less depressed or cynical about the people who are trying to suppress the progress of mankind and get them to stand up and be the leaders of the country, because they're actually the ones qualified to make policy.
Good question.
Very, very good question, because that was the nature of why I started my campaign going back to 2010 in the first place, because there had to be a voice for these individuals who felt like they didn't have a voice, for NASA workers or so forth who were, well, if they spoke out, they might get their jobs taken away from them. People were already afraid because you had the cuts going on, and that has been going on for quite some time. And people were saying, oh, we have to settle. I go to these events, NASA events with a NASA alumni or other institutions in relation to NASA. And, people would ask me, what are you doing here? People who are running for office don't come to NASA events. They don't care. They just make a budget for us. And I said, well, are you going to accept that? What is this institution's role in making policy? And so it's funny because people would look at me in shock and awe, first of all, that I would try to get into these events, demand that I get into these events, and demand that we change the subject of discussion, that we're not just going to sit here and take what's given to us, because NASA is not just some private institution or some thank you, some country club. It's right. This is the nation's This is an organization of the nation, and the American people have they actually deserve for the representatives of NASA and the representatives of our scientific community to be able to organize the nation around, hey, we're doing this for you. We're doing this because look what we can accomplish, as Tom pointed out. Look at the great developments, technologies. But more importantly, it's going back to what we have organized this whole discussion around and tried to communicate it's the question of how do we define a new direction for mankind? What are the aims of mankind? Where must mankind go? How do we reach mankind's extraterrestrial imperative? What it is our mission to conquer space. It's not just some thing that if you're rich and so forth and you have a lot of money to waste, you decide you want to spend it on, fancy space endeavors. This is a mission for people get involved with NASA, and the population who knows nothing about NASA gets inspired by it because somebody has said, hey, look, we have to have a mission. We have to have a vision. And so I think, it's absolutely correct. I'm hoping that this discussion is getting around broadly, widely, people watching it from all over the country, all over the world, who are saying that, hey, somebody in the United States, people in the United States are not lost and are thinking and want to see this nation working with other nations and developing and actually progressing as we should be, as is our nature as human beings.
Hey, Kesha?
Please.
Let me chime in a little bit, okay?
Okay.
I want to pick up on something that Hal mentioned, because Hal mentioned that his initial prejudices that he was taught when he was younger were totally dispelled once he started actually working with the Russians. And he found out that, yes, hey, they are pretty good engineers. And they, other than the politicians, really want to do the right thing. Well, we need to do that here too. I think the way that we could do some real good is to promote international conferences where people are free to talk about technology. I've been lucky in the sense that over the last few years, I've gone to a number of them, mostly in Europe, but I meet people from all over the world. I attended a conference in Bulgaria last year and met a number of Russians and made some really neat relationships with them, which are still continuing. This fall, I'm going to be going to China, and I'm going to be presenting 2 lectures in China on climate. It happens to be my current specialty. But this is something where I can help the Chinese because I really believe they don't have the same misconceptions about climate that many of our people have right here. So I feel I'm contributing. I'm going to learn when I go there. I'm going to meet other people. I'm going to learn from them. I learned from people in Bulgaria. I'm going to be learning from people in Vienna. We need to do that here. We had a great conference here a couple of years ago, a marine insurance conference here in Houston. It was a neat seminar. People from all over the world came, and the discussions were free and open. And that's how you get rid of the prejudices. You don't need to have national barriers that we create for propaganda purposes to demonize people in other countries. We need to work. We have a world here. And as my colleagues at NASA here who are in the audience and Hal know, when those barriers get broken, everybody wins.
Yes. This is for our special guest.
Special guest. These guys are special. The people
You're getting your stand-ups. Could you use your Chinese connections to get a good translation of that physics training that was given from the space station?
Okay, you know something? That's a great question. I'm going to try. And the fact is, when we landed on the moon, people in Europe celebrated for us. We've had astronauts visiting Europe since, our Apollo astronauts. I know one of Jack Schmidt's rocks is in a museum in the country of Holland. And it was one that he picked up and put there, and they're very proud of it. Did we invite the Chinese astronauts to the White House? Did we invite them anywhere in this country and celebrate them the way our astronauts are celebrated? No, we didn't do it, and we should do it. So I will do what you can, all right? I'll try to get a translation, and I'll bring it here to Texas, and maybe Kesha can send it around to the schools.
Okay, I think we're going to take 2 more questions here, and so that we don't have to like run out of here, because I believe this place closes at 5 o'clock. So you first, and then you will be our last question.
So briefly, we have a bad history of letting Skylab fall to the Earth. We didn't spend the $2 billion to recertify the space shuttles, which were brilliant and still effective machines. So we are faced with the Hubble Space Telescope and the International Space Station. And the International Space Station is only certified to 2024. They're extending it to 2028. I've checked with management at headquarters. If you go to 2040 or 2050 with structural protection, and the DoD conveniently is making rollout solar arrays, so you can replace the solar arrays. What are you two doing, or what can we do to make it so we don't get blown over by naivete to cancel the space shuttle? We can't let this happen to Hubble. It needs to get boosted up. We can't let this happen to the space station. So you folks all need to know, don't take it on face value, because both those machines should be kept up for 3 or 4 more decades.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up, because I just went to an event at the University of Houston Clear Lake, and the way the takedown of the Hubble space shuttle was being presented was, it's okay because it's going to be replaced by the James
Webb telescope.
Webb telescope.
Still sitting in a hangar in Goddard, by the way.
Yeah.
No,
Still
but
working on it.
We all have to understand, Hubble is in the visible range. That means they're crisp, amazing pictures. The Webb is infrared, fuzzy. It will never be the same. They'll complement each other. The Webb is not a replacement for the Hubble.
That's what you said. They complement each other, and I absolutely agree with that. But I saw, this fight just in terms of the fact that you've had all of these different initiatives going around to save the Hubble. And I mean, right now, I think the thing is one, the American people, as you said, have to be educated on the importance of these missions. And then secondly, we have to make a demand that we cannot have any more replacements of these very vital missions or shutdowns of these very vital missions. But I think the key thing is educating people on their significance, what they actually do, what they represent. And then that's why we need a real education program, a science driver program in the nation right now, so we can get people to understand that, well, what's the intention? The intention is to shut down the capability for us to actually make the types of discoveries that we need to be making. And a lot of people got extremely impassioned by what the Hubble did. I mean, one, it's a manned mission. It was started right around the time that we had the International Space Station. And it also actually has produced some very valuable images, resources, and output in terms of what we can come to further know and investigate in terms of the origination of galaxies, the distances, and the problem is, so as I said, we need a science driver, a real education program, and we need to make sure that we get leadership in there who is not out to protect Wall Street financial interests over the mission of our nation. Because the first thing about, we don't have the money, we can't do it because we don't have the money. Well, you had all the money to bail out JP Morgan Chase and all of these other people. So to say we don't have the money for these viable and very pertinent programs in our space program for the progress of mankind, not acceptable. I'm sorry, yes.
Do you think, like bad taste I had in my mouth about China and Russia growing up was because they're communistic countries. I know Russia isn't anymore, but communism and this is democratic countries. So like, that's why to me, I thought those are like anti, we don't want nothing to do with it. I know times have changed, but do you think that has any little rub off the communism?
It might have some rub off. You had McCarthyism, you had all these, ooh, be afraid of all these people and so forth. But the problem is that I think Tom said it exactly right. We have to look at each other as human beings. I mean, all these different systems of political systems and policies, they change over time, so forth. But the real issue is there is two directions and thinking about the nature of mankind. One is that human beings are just animals to be exploited and destroyed, and that we cannot overcome our differences, and we're going to have to always be fighting each other. The other thing is that we have to look for the common interests, the win-win policies that unite all of us together. And if we sit here and talk about, oh, I can't work with that nation because they're communist or socialist or whatever you want to call it, that's just an insane policy. So you're going to miss out on some great opportunities.
Defeat the oligarchy in the United States.
Yeah.
All I can tell you, China is more capitalism than we are.
There you go. So on that note, I would like to thank everyone for being here today. This has been a very inspiring and useful discussion. I hope you have been motivated to go out, first of all, to join us in this effort, educate your family, your friends, educate your Congress member. I know that's going to take some knocking some skulls to get these guys educated. But we have a very unique opportunity in front of us. The world is shifting right now, and that there is a moment where we can now, as I said at the beginning, define the age of reason and give mankind a new mission. So it's been fun. Thank you. Thank you very much.